thinking. All right, so with the chaotic day, let's start the endocrine, then we'll do the sensory, and technically we end at 1, so I'm sure by that time it'll be fixed. If not, I don't know, we'll figure something out. When the time comes, okay? Everybody gets it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, endocrine system. When I talk about the endocrine system, what do you think we're going to be talking about? Secreting glands. What do they secrete? Hormones. So endocrine system deals with secretion of hormones. Okay? In this chapter, you have to make sure what endocrine glands they are. Basically, what do they secrete, and then what organ do they go and exert their function on? Because in physiology, you're going to be learning what is the function of that hormone. Okay? What is the main effect, and how does it cause that to happen? So, basically, endocrine system is tissue glands that produce and secrete hormones. Okay? We have endocrine glands and we have exocrine glands. We do not talk about the exocrine glands. We'll talk about them when we deal with the digestive. But just to summarize right now, secretes mucus, sweat, tears, digestive fluids, etc. Okay? So this we'll talk about later. Okay, not in this lecture. We're going to focus on endocrine glands only. Ductless organs that secrete their products into the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. Okay? That's the main thing. Now, the endocrine system works in a negative feedback loop. Meaning, if something is too high, too low, okay, so if it's abnormal, so it's, because remember the set point was a point that is normal, the homeostasis. So endocrine system works when something is too high or too low. It will go stimulate an endocrine organ. That endocrine organ will secrete a hormone. That hormone will go to target organs, to target cells or tissues. And in turn, that target tissue will either, they'll cause the reversal to come back towards normal. Does that make sense? Now some of them, the target organ secretes something else, which in turn causes the reversal to go towards normal. And another one, that target gland directly affects a different cell or system. Okay? Now I'm just summarizing right now because every hormone works differently. Okay? Now, these are the hormones you're responsible to know. So, you're supposed to know the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, which has the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Okay? Adrenal gland, which have a cortex, it has a medulla. Kidneys, we don't talk about right now. I'll discuss it when we deal with the urinary system. Ovaries, I don't really talk ovaries and testes right now. I'll cover that in the reproductive system. Pineal gland, I don't talk about. Okay. Thyroid gland, we talk about right now. Parathyroid gland, we talk about right now. Thymus, I don't talk about right now, or I don't talk about it. Heart, again, we'll talk about it when we deal with the cardiovascular system. Stomach, when we deal about the digestive system. We talk about pancreas. Intestines, when we deal with the digestive system. Okay? So the ones that cross out somewhere else in another chapter, I tend to correlate it. I try to tie it in. The ones I'm focusing right now, which have, they don't technically belong to any other group, another system. Okay? Now, what hormones are you responsible to know under the hypothalamus? Releasing hormone and inhibitory hormone. So the reds are basically the glands you're supposed to know, and those glands secrete different hormones. Anterior pituitary lobe secretes ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, prolactin, growth hormone. You're responsible to know all of those. Posterior lobe, ADH, oxytocin. Cortex is cortisol, aldosterone. Medulla is epinephrine, norepinephrine. thyroid gland, and thyroxine, triiodothyroxine, calcitonin, parathyroid hormone, glucagon, insulin, somatostatin. So for next week's exam, you're supposed to know these hormones, these glands, these hormones. And then throughout the chapter, I won't get too much in detail, okay, because that's more physiology. But I'll start, you have to know which gland is stimulated by this hormone. So if I tell you TSH is secreted, what gland does TSH go work on? What gland produces TSH? Does that make sense? Okay. So now the master endocrine glands. Now, the master endocrine glands, they're main endocrine glands that regulate the rest of the endocrine system. You have the hypothalamus. Okay, you have the hypothalamus, which is A in the image. So right here is the hypothalamus. So we're taking this photo right here and enlarging it. Okay. Do you guys remember hypothalamus is what part of the brain? It consists of, makes up what? Dicephalon. What other structures belong to a dicephalon? Hypothalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. All right. Now, hypothalamus basically is one main organ. Another main organ is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is made up of two lobes, two sections, anterior and posterior. Oh, before I forget, your clinical thinking for this week has already been uploaded under week 5. Okay? There's actually 2 case scenarios. One portrays to the endocrine part, one portrays to the sensory system. Now, so the 2 main endocrine glands are hypothalamus and the pituitary. Now the pituitary has 2 parts, anterior and posterior. So anterior pituitary gland and the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Usually people just say anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, but they're actually talking to one gland but 2 lobes. Okay? So collectively, okay, so if I say C is posterior and B is anterior lobe. So right here, this entire structure is the pituitary gland, but you can see that it has 2 distinct lobes. Okay? This is the posterior lobe, and this is the anterior lobe. If you can see, where do you think they're located? Where do you find the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus? What's the location? Diencephalon has only the hypothalamus, not the pituitary gland.
Midbrain.
Not midbrain.
Midbrain? Temporal lobe.
Brainstem is what? So, pituitary gland is actually located underneath the hypothalamus. It doesn't have a special name for it. But, so right now, it's part of the cerebrum, or the brain. The hypothalamus is part of the diencephalon. Pituitary gland is found underneath it, but it's found in the brain. Or the cerebrum. Now, the hypothalamus is connected to both of the glands. It's connected to the posterior lobe as well as the anterior lobe. But their connection is different. Okay? So hypothalamus connection to the anterior lobe, okay, and to the posterior. So the hypothalamus is connected to both lobes but in a different way. The hypothalamus is connected to the anterior lobe via special blood vessels. Between the hypothalamus and the anterior lobe, there are a set of blood vessels which are found there. So what happens, the hypothalamus will secrete the hormone into that blood vessel. That blood vessel will travel to the anterior lobe, and that's how the products get to the anterior lobe. Does that make sense? So there's a special set of blood vessels that only extends from the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay? Now, how is the posterior lobe connected? As you can see right here, there's basically a tissue that spans basically from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary, or the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It's called the stalk, or infundibulum. Infundibulum. Okay, infundibulum. It's a stalk, or the proper name is infundibulum. Okay, and I'll explain what that infundibulum is. So, basically, hypothalamus, anterior lobe is connected via what? Blood vessels. How about the hypothalamus and the posterior lobe? Hmm? Or the stalk, yes. Okay. So D is that infundibulum or the stalk in the image. So D is that infundibulum. Any questions so far? Yes.
So you said the pituitary gland is located underneath the cerebrum?
The pituitary gland is located underneath, basically, the hypothalamus. A hypothalamus is part of diencephalon. The pituitary is not part of diencephalon, so therefore we just say it's found in cerebrum. Diencephalon is part of the cerebrum. Different location. Now let's talk about neuroendocrine cells. When I say that name, neuroendocrine cells, what goes into your mind? Besides the brain, what else? Neurons and? So basically, it connects, it sounds like a neuron, but it's endocrine. So, let me ask you, what is the function of a neuron? Electrical impulse, as I said, occurs on that count. But what is the purpose of a neuron? How does the neuron communicate with each other? Huh? Action potential occur on the neuron. But how was information going from what? Neurotransmitters. So the purpose of the neuron was to release neurotransmitters, right? That chemical signal. Now, what was the structure of a neuron? What did you have? What is the typical structure of a neuron? Cell body, dendrites, and axon, correct? So basically, a neuroendocrine cell looks like a neuron, okay? Structure looks like a neuron. Cell body, dendrites, axon. Okay? Functionally, a neuron is supposed to secrete a neurotransmitter, but this is not a neuron, it's a neuroendocrine cell. Therefore, it secretes hormones. Secretes hormones. Does that make sense? This is why it's called a neuroendocrine cell. Structurally, it looks like a neuron. It has dendrites, it has cell bodies, it has axon terminal. But it does not release a neurotransmitter, it actually releases hormones. Therefore, it's called a neuroendocrine cell. So basically right here, you could see that this is the hypothalamus. You could see the dendrites and the cell body. Dendrites and the cell body. And basically, this part are the axons. Now, what does the axons make up?
The white matter.
Okay, but forget about the white matter. Okay, this is we're talking about our endocrine system. Looking at the image, what can you say? What does the axons actually make up?
The canal.
What is this?
The posterior lobe.
Is this a posterior lobe?
Yeah.
This is the anterior lobe. This is the posterior lobe. So what is the axon making up? The stalk. The infundibulum. So what is infundibulum? It's actually axons running through. It's made up of axons. Does that make sense? So the span and the connect. The cell body and dendrites are found in the hypothalamus. The axon, okay, the axon itself makes up the stalk. And axon terminal is found in the posterior pituitary. Does that make sense? So do you see that here is the hypothalamus, here is the posterior pituitary. The cell body's dendrites are found within the hypothalamus. The axons run through making up the stalk with the infundibulum, and the axons terminate within the posterior pituitary. So it spans from the hypothalamus all the way to the posterior pituitary. It's one cell. Does that make sense? One cell starts in the hypothalamus, goes all the way down, and terminates within the posterior pituitary. Different segments of that cell is found in different areas. Cell body dendrites is the hypothalamus. The axon, the body of the axon, okay, is found in the infundibulum or the stalk, and the axon terminal is found in the posterior pituitary. Yes? Does that make sense? This is what I call neuroendocrine cells. They structurally look like a neuron. Functionally, they secrete hormones, and they span the entire hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary.
I'm sorry, your abbreviations for the span and connect, if you don't mind just saying those one more time.
Cell body, dendrites, basically found in the hypothalamus. Axon is found in the stalk. Axon terminal, posterior pituitary.
Thank you.
Does that make sense? Okay, now we have two types. Okay. So basically, we have two different types, right? There's a green and then there's a blue, because they're two different nuclei. So you have two different types of cell bodies. You might have multiple of one cell body, but they're two distinct types. Okay? So one is the ADH, and another one is oxytocin. The reason, the nuclei names actually different, and in physiology you'll find more in detail. Right now I'm just trying to show you the two main. Okay? So there's ADH. What does ADH stand for? Anti-diuretic hormone. Anti-diuretic hormone. I just got an email from them that it's done, but we'll finish this lecture, then we'll do the exam. Because that room has to be empty at 12:30, because there's another class from there at 12:30. So as soon as we finish the endocrine system, you'll go take the test, and then for, after that we'll start the sensory. Okay, now, listen up. So there are two basically nuclei because both of them secrete or produce different hormones. One hormone is called ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. The second one is called oxytocin. Okay? So what happens is the cell bodies produce the hormones. Okay? And once it's produced, that hormone travels down via the axon and it gets stored within the axon terminal. And it's secreted from the axon terminal. So if I ask you, which gland produces ADH? Pancreas, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, hypothalamus, or I don't know, thyroid gland. Which gland produces ADH? Hypothalamus, because it's produced in the hypothalamus. But what gland secretes ADH? Posterior pituitary. Does that make sense? Because it's produced here and then it was sent for storage, and it gets released from its storage site. Yes.
Is it in the vesicle while it travels, or is it just by itself, the hormones?
No, it's in a vesicle.
Okay.
It's in a vesicle, and it gets stored as a vesicle. It's produced by the hypothalamus, but secreted from the posterior pituitary. Because remember, it gets produced here, but then once it's produced, it doesn't stay here. It gets sent down and it gets stored within the posterior pituitary in the axon terminal. Yes, posterior pituitary, not anterior. Posterior pituitary where it's stored, and that's the gland that secretes the hormone when it's needed. Okay, so now this is ADH. Now let me ask you, what does, when I say anti-diuretic hormone, what do you think that hormone does? Huh? What does anti-diuretic hormone mean? What about the rest? Stops you from peeing, stops you from urinating. Anti-diuretic means urination. Anti-diuretic hormone, a hormone that inhibits urination, basically. Okay? So, what does that mean? Basically, when you have a decrease in blood pressure, when your blood pressure drops, it stimulates your posterior pituitary. Your posterior pituitary will secrete ADH. ADH will go to the kidneys. ADH will travel to the kidneys. Basically increase in blood pressure occurs. Okay, because we're not teaching you how it happens or what happens. That's more physiology. My point is when your blood pressure is dropped, it stimulates your posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary releases ADH, which will travel to the kidneys, and it increases your blood pressure. Does that make sense? So the function of ADH is to increase your blood pressure. Yes.
When you write this plus,
It stimulates.
the drop in the BP is actually stimulating
Uh-huh. That's a signal. That's a...
I thought it was to stop the urine, or does it do both?
It does, but I'm not getting into that detail.
Okay.
That's more physiology, how it does
So it has
it.
a function.
No, just right now memorize it,
Okay.
okay? Okay, because your blood pressure has dropped, therefore your fluid has dropped. If you stop urinating, it means you're keeping your fluid back into your system. Therefore, because of increased fluid, your blood pressure increases. But that becomes exactly more in detail in physiology, which I mean, I could, I will just ask you this. Okay? So, decreased blood pressure stimulates your posterior pituitary to